Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we are a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast, I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation and strategies from the water sector, academia and beyond. Is flood risk ever as simple as being from a single source? Or do many communities live with the reality of multiple sources of flood risk? How do these sources interact? And could vital risk management be missed if planning only considers one? In today's episode, we're exploring how groundwater flooding interacts with the other sources of flooding. Joining me today is Dr Paul Ellis, Director of Hydrolex, an independent consultancy specialising in groundwater, surface water and flood risk management. Paul has led extensive research into groundwater-surface water interactions and the national mapping of groundwater flooding across the UK. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me and to talk on my favourite subject. So yes, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So to start off, how did you get into this sector? Groundwater flooding, it's kind of a niche. So what kind of sparked your interest in it?
I did some research back in Birmingham on the River Tame, and I was looking at the contribution of groundwater to the river that flows through Birmingham, looking at the flows and also the contaminants that come out of the Birmingham aquifer. And so as part of that, I did a lot of monitoring, looking at river levels and groundwater levels, and you can very clearly see the response there. And then that sort of developed with my work at various companies along the way, looking at the mapping of groundwater flood risk. As you say, it's a forgotten source of flooding. There's no mapping available. So back in 2013, we began a programme of mapping the flood risk across the UK. And one of the key mechanisms is this interaction between rivers and the sea and the tides with the groundwater system. And on occasions that causes the groundwater to reach the surface and causes flooding.
So can you speak a bit more about the relationship between rivers, tidal, which I'm assuming is like sea and coastal, and groundwater flooding?
Yes, so it's an observed thing that when river levels rise, you get a coincident rise in groundwater levels, which can lead to flooding. You just have to ask people with basements that live along sort of river valleys and corridors, such as the River Severn where we are. And it's very obvious. It's been recorded in boreholes as well. You can compare river levels and groundwater and you can see they follow the same shape, the same pattern. So really it's that response between the groundwater system and the surface water system and how they interact with each other, which goes on all the time. But on certain occasions, that can lead to very high groundwater levels, which causes the flooding. Many of us have probably observed this relationship between sort of surface water and groundwater. When we've been to the beach, I think many people have dug a hole in the sand and it's filled with water, and that's sort of essentially showing you where the water table sits. And then on one side, in this case, instead of a river, it's the sea, but you've got that sea level. So that sets the minimum groundwater level at the sea, at that interface. And then further inland, you have the groundwater that's flowing towards the coast from the high ground to the low ground. And that fresh water flows towards the sea. And then you can sort of measure that water table in your little hole. And if you're really keen and you watch it during the day, you will actually see that level goes up and down. And as the tide comes in, you will see the groundwater level rise in response to that. So it's essentially a really good way of thinking about how that water table goes up and down along the beach or indeed along a river valley. That's sort of a good way to visualise it.
And in these circumstances, is it the permeable superficial deposits that you're talking about, or is this also with aquifers as well?
When I think of an aquifer, it's essentially something that's permeable and can conduct groundwater, allow groundwater flow through it. So you can subdivide them between bedrock aquifers, such as the chalk and the sandstone or the Cotswold limestone, and superficial aquifers. But both do respond to change in surface water levels at the sea or the river. But quite often it's the superficial deposits which are actually on the surface and make that connection with the river. So on the beach it's the sand, in a river valley, it's the sort of river terrace gravels. And they can often be quite permeable. So it's those deposits where groundwater is present in an aquifer and it can be transmitted, that they're where you get the occurrence of the groundwater flooding and that sort of interaction with the surface water system. So you need two things to allow an interaction to occur. You need the presence of that aquifer which holds the groundwater, but also there needs to be a connection between the surface water course or the river or the sea and that aquifer. If they're not physically connected, so if the aquifer doesn't extend beneath the river, or potentially in some cases you might get a layer of impermeable clay or other material, mud flats on the beach or alluvium in a river, and if that's a clay sort of forms a barrier, then that again can limit that connection. And the extent to which they interact with each other does depend on that connection. A tenuous connection means little interaction. A very good connection means a rapid response between changes in groundwater and surface water level. I think one way to think of it, moving on from sort of the beach analogy, if we think about the water cycle, I'm sure we've all seen that in our geography lesson, where you have the sort of cross-section through the land and the sea. So you get a significant portion of rainfall falls on the ground and runs off into the rivers. But then another portion will infiltrate and recharge those buried aquifers. And then this leads to sort of the groundwater flow system. And that flow goes from the high ground towards the low point, which generally that's the coast or the river levels. And then that groundwater will then discharge to those river or coastal systems. So people are familiar with springs, where you can see sort of a focused point of discharge. But actually, due to the wet nature, most rivers in the UK are receiving a groundwater discharge, more so when they cover these large aquifer sections, because it's that groundwater discharge that keeps the river flowing when it's not raining and during the summer. So that's the groundwater base flow. That's the groundwater coming out through the bed of the river and discharging in there. And that's also why the flow in a river increases as you walk downstream, because the groundwater accumulates. And so the flow increases. But it's often not really obvious to people. They just don't sort of look beneath the ground and assume it's sort of just flow coming in from the rain and streams, etc. But it is this key contribution from groundwater system that's not just important for groundwater flooding, it sort of keeps the rivers flowing, high ecology relies on it. It's the transmission of nutrients and contaminants from the groundwater system into our rivers and the sea. This interface between groundwater and surface water is quite important. It's operating all the time, but it's when you get a sort of a more dramatic response in relation to, say, a sea level rise or a river in flood, then that's when the groundwater levels rise more and may come out at the surface and cause flooding. If we think about this connection and what's actually happening, you have the river, if we just take the river in this example, is the boundary. So that's the boundary condition. You've got the river level there, and then you've got the groundwater on the higher ground, higher in the catchment. The water levels there are higher, and that causes groundwater to flow towards the river and eventually discharge to the river. And so adjacent to that river, the groundwater levels tend to be quite shallow and generally at or above what the surface water level is immediately adjacent to the river. There are some stretches in the UK where potentially you've got an abstraction borehole or something which draws down the groundwater table, and you could get sections of river that actually lose surface water into the ground. But that's quite rare in the UK because we've got a lot of rainfall and borehole abstractions are regulated. There are other instances where you get seasonal streams, so higher in the catchment, such as these chalk streams, you'll see that as the groundwater table fluctuates, it will reach the surface in the winter and you'll get flow in the stream, and then as the rainfall and recharge decline in the summer, the water table drops and it only will reach the surface further down the valley, so the flow stops higher up but continues further down. So again, those are examples of interaction between groundwater and surface water system.
Have you noticed any change due to climate change to these systems that are in place? Have you noticed if there's been any difference over the past few years?
To really see the impact of climate change, that's a sort of something that can be measured over the decades, but there are certainly predictions that climate change is going to cause an impact on this interaction between surface water and the groundwater, because you might get more intense rainfall, but it might happen over a shorter period. So I think predictions are the recharge season will occur over a compressed period. So instead of, at the moment, it's November to sort of March, you might get sort of drier summers, wetter winters, but sort of more intense rainfall. So recharge may occur between November and February, for example. So you'll get that same amount of water, but potentially compressed into a shorter period, so more spiky variations in the water table. In response to river levels, so the Environment Agency are predicting some significant increases in peak river levels, which then may have an impact on the adjacent groundwater level. So if you've got a higher river level for longer, you get more of a response to the adjacent groundwater level. So that's one thing. And then sea level rise, predictions are 2100, I think it's between 30 centimetres and 1.2 metre rise. So that's very significant. And if you think about this interface between the groundwater and the surface water, that's quite significant. If that occurs all the way around our coastline and along our rivers, then that's going to have a sort of a knock-on effect. Water levels will rise along the coast, groundwater levels will rise in response immediately inland. Perhaps I can talk to you a bit more about this interface, this dynamic equilibrium at the boundary between the groundwater and the surface water system. On one side you have the river level fluctuating up and down, and then on the other side you have the groundwater flow towards the river, which has been driven by the groundwater levels higher in the catchment, and those levels in turn go up and down seasonally. So with more recharge in the winter, you get higher groundwater levels further away, and that will increase flow to the river, drive more groundwater flow into the river. That's why you get higher river base flows in the winter. So you've got this sort of equilibrium that's constantly varying, but as surface water levels go up and down, that will affect groundwater at that point. And then you've got the groundwater level at sort of some distance, the regional groundwater level, which also goes up and down. And then the water table sort of joins between the two, and you get it sort of fluctuating. Obviously, it's nearer the surface in the river valley because it's essentially at or just above the surface water level for most of the time. And then when you get a very significant rise in the river level, such as during a flood event or something of that nature, potentially that water level in the river could go up several metres or get a tidal surge, etc. Then the equilibrium will then need to adjust, and it can adjust pretty rapidly. So say you get a 1 metre rise in the river, then that would propagate out into the adjacent groundwater table, sort of like a ripple or a wave effect. So as the groundwater is trying to discharge to the river, which it was under normal conditions because the water level groundwater is slightly higher than the river level, so that drives the flow, the discharge. But then for a short period you might get a reversal of that, and then the groundwater table will back up, and then you'll see that rise, and that will sort of ripple out. So you will notice the rise, the further you are from the river, the longer it will take to observe a rise associated with that river rise. But that's what happens. So you get if you've got a basement or something along the riverbank, as the river levels go up, then a short period afterwards you will see sort of water levels and seepage start to occur in your basement. It's a sort of really a response, and then as the river level drops, then the groundwater table will drop as well. The duration of these events often is related to how long the river level is high or river level is in flood. They tend to be shorter lived than the other main type of groundwater flooding, which is from these big bedrock aquifers, and that could be for months because that's a sort of a seasonal change in the big regional water table, and once it's up, it's up. Whereas these interactions with the surface water system generally last as long as the high tide or the river level is high. What you'll have the two sort of one overprinting the other immediately adjacent to the water courses. So get the interaction between the two main groundwater flood mechanisms.
And do you think there's any risk of, if you're doing a project to try and lower flood risk, considering the river and the adjacent surrounding area, is there any risk if groundwater flooding isn't considered in that, or groundwater interaction with the river isn't considered within that?
It's a very important part of sort of flood defence review of the scheme, even if the flood defences are for the river or for the tide, because of this connection. If it's there, obviously you need it to be an aquifer present that connects between the two. But if it is there, then you could have the condition where you put in a new flood defence and even though the river is, say, contained behind it, groundwater levels on the other side will rise in response to the high river level, and you could still get flooding. The way around that is to sort of study the geology, the hydrogeology beneath those proposed flood defences. If you do identify an aquifer, then you have to take some measures to try and cut off or block this hydraulic conductivity or connectivity between the two systems. So this is often done by putting some sort of cut-off wall, blocking off the aquifer to at least a certain extent, and then that will reduce the potential for hydraulic connection between the two. And so if there is a response, it might be sort of reduced or damped, and so flooding from the groundwater would be less. So that's the aim. The other side of that is, as we mentioned before, rivers rely on the groundwater discharge throughout the summer to keep them flowing. So if you put in a flood defence and stop the groundwater connection, you may reduce the base flow and the discharge during the summer months, and that can have negative ecological impacts. And then also you would potentially get a backing up of groundwater behind that barrier. So it's a sort of a known thing where engineered structures, buildings or basements are put in and block off part of the aquifer or remove it with some sort of impermeable barrier. Behind that, you would get a build-up on the upgradient side. You might get an increase in groundwater levels. These things have to be considered as part of the overall engineering design.
So we've been talking about surface water, but we've not specifically yet spoken about surface water flooding. So we're thinking flash flooding from like very heavy rainfall, so not necessarily linked to any river or any tide, but from that. Is there any interaction between that source of flooding and groundwater that you know of?
There could be a few ways. I mean, groundwater is very often present with all the other forms of flooding. It can simply act as a pathway. So in a surface water or river flood, it could just act as a way for that water to move from the surface water into your property. We talked about movement of water beneath flood defences and the impact of that. But equally, if you put a flood barrier around your house, we've had several cases I've been involved with where sort of barriers and walls were put around, but not masked into the groundwater system. So the water just came up on the inside of the wall and the pumps weren't sufficient to prevent it flooding the house. So that was one way where water can get into a property if you're built on gravels or some permeable deposit. It provides a pathway. Another way with surface water was if the ground is saturated, so you may have the water table at or very close to the surface. In some conditions, particularly permeable areas, when you get a rainfall, a certain portion of that may infiltrate, even though with intense rainfall it tends to be not much time for infiltration to occur, but in very permeable situations it can. But if the ground is all saturated because of a high water table, you also get a certain capillary rise. So above the water table, the ground will be pretty wet because of capillary action, etc. So you may get increased runoff because of a high water table as well, which can exacerbate surface water flooding. And then the other occasion is when you do get surface water flooding, it's going to go into the natural drainage system and the ditches, etc. But if the water table is high and those ditches are already full of groundwater, then you can get flooding. Another very interesting thing is potentially the sewer system. So I've done quite a lot of work looking at infiltration to sewer systems from the groundwater, and it's quite a significant problem across much of the UK's network where they're on these major aquifers and on the permeable superficial gravels, etc. A lot of the sewers are old, they have limited capacity, and a lot of them are leaky, so groundwater can get in when it's very high, and it then starts flowing through the sewer network. That's clean water, so obviously clean water generally taking up capacity that you want to reserve for your foul drainage, or indeed if it's a surface water sewer. So therefore the groundwater reduces the capacity of those sewer networks, and then you're more likely to get exceedance sort of overflows, sewer flooding or discharge into the river systems, which is this big topic of conversation about trying to clean up sewer spills, etc. And a lot of that could be laid at the door of groundwater reducing capacity.
So it sounds like similarly, if you don't plan for groundwater and you're doing surface water management, risk management, and you build these new scrapes and these new ponds and these new ditches, that if you haven't considered that they may be filled during periods of high groundwater, if that is like the geology of the area, again, that management technique might not work in all cases.
Yes, I think the way to do, though, is to embrace the groundwater and make it a feature if you can. So it's obviously, you've seen these old quarry pits and gravel pits. The groundwater supports a nice lake and ecological features. So the same could happen with suds features, but you would need to estimate what sort of freeboard you would need above that typical groundwater level in order to provide your storage. Equally, if you're putting in some sort of buried infrastructure or tanks or crates, etc. But you do want to understand what the groundwater would do. There's issues with flotation. You could cause some sort of cracking or damage to your buried structures. So it's important to understand from that point of view. And, infiltration is right at the top of the hierarchy in terms of where to get rid of water for suds and discharge it. So there is a driver to use that, but you just need to understand what that variation in the water table would be, and be prepared that on some occasions you might get flow sort of coming the other way, or it might not infiltrate for a period. But obviously you want to infiltrate as much as you can to follow the natural systems and processes, but you just have to have a contingency plan if that doesn't work as proposed.
Groundwater, I think, can be quite difficult for people to understand, in that the water that comes up, or the water table that rises in a certain area, isn't necessarily always fed by the rain in that area. Like, it can travel quite long distances, I understand, if that's correct.
Yes, so if you think about your water cycle, so in a big aquifer like the Chalk, the travel times from where the rain falls on the top of the hill to coming down into the river valley or at the coast, that can be, hundreds of years in some cases. In other aquifers, we have travel times of thousands of years. That's sort of in deeper parts and very slow moving. Adjacent to the river, travel time will be sort of probably less, measured in weeks and months. Obviously that extends the further away from the river you get. But even on a sort of a quite constrained river terrace gravel, which may just occupy the bottom of a river valley, that water's still falling during the course of the year, and at the edge of the valley it takes a certain period to travel from there to the river. So that's generally not a quick process. Groundwater is generally slow. There's a lot of storage in the aquifer and the movements take time. But that's what's powering it. It's the rainfall that falls into the aquifer, and then gravity helps it move to the lowest point, which is the river.
So it means that you don't always know when the groundwater level will be high unless you have monitoring in place.
No, that is key. So when you're excavating your trial pits, or people often put boreholes in for structural and geotechnical reasons, the advice would also be to install that with a piezometer or some sort of monitoring equipment so that you can check what the groundwater level's doing. Generally speaking, to understand that fluctuation, you'd want to get groundwater levels over a full sort of hydrologic year, so during summer and winter. Typically, water levels would start to respond sort of November time and reach their peak January, February, decline from March onwards. So you want to get that full record of the variation in groundwater levels over that yearly period. But then you have to also think that groundwater level, there's many sort of interannual cycles. So you can look at one of these long borehole records in the Chalk or sandstone, and you can see the peak between one year and the next. There might be significant difference. The Chalk, you get variations of 10, 20 metres, very significant. So the peak in one year might be substantially lower than the peak in the next. So that's another thing. You have to have a sense of what the variation between those peaks between years might be. If you're investigating a site and you just take a measurement in the summer, chances are you haven't hit the peak groundwater level. And then even if you get that level in the winter, you should just sort of be aware of what variability there might be associated in a really wet winter. There are some ways to sort of get a good estimate of what that might be from what the river level's doing. So if you're really concerned with permeable superficial deposits, you can look at what's the variation in river levels, which is, as we've talked about, that one end of the dynamic boundary conditions, which may be affecting groundwater levels adjacent. So you may expect variations of at least that range in river levels sort of to propagate out into the floodplain. We've
touched a bit on what the activities of people can do. So you said building down occasionally had impacts surrounding them that they weren't expecting. But is there ways that man-made activities are impacting surface water and groundwater interactions?
Well, yes. If you sort of channel engineering. If you move the course of a river, if you do a river diversion, then depending on whether you line that section of river will affect how it interacts with the surface water system, because it's got to go somewhere. Originally that groundwater was discharging at the original location, so it's got to find a new place to discharge. So you have to assess the implications of what happens there. Done a lot of work with quarries. That's very interesting. So we talked about when they finish with a quarry and it fills with water, it can be a great ecological habitat. If you ever go to these nature reserves which are in old gravel pits, you can see between the summer and winter water levels go high. Sometimes they cause flooding. Sometimes that's on purpose because that's great for wetland habitat. You'll observe a very strong connection between the water levels in the river and what's happening in those quarry lakes. And the same on the, if you go along the coast, sort of the tidal mudflats, etc. There is a certain amount of groundwater and connection and fresh water coming out along those coastal transition zones, which is quite important. In terms of basements, did a lot of work in London, so they're constrained for space there, so people are extending downwards and they have a requirement to do a basement impact assessment. You look at the aquifer that might be present and whether it has a groundwater table and whether the new development might interact with that groundwater system and cause problems for neighbours. A key thing that we look at is it on an aquifer? There's a lot of gravel in London, these river terrace gravels, Taplow gravel. And is that in continuity with a watercourse nearby? Quite a few interesting ones, the lost rivers of London. I don't know if you've heard about those. So a lot of the original rivers in London were put into sewers, so they're underground now. But again, they may still be in continuity with the aquifer on either side, so you have to find out if they're present and what they would do, what's the water level in that river compared with what's the level of your basement, and what's the potential that a flood in the river may raise groundwater levels which could interact with your structure. That's another thing. We could talk about the Oxford flood defence scheme. So that was another thing I was involved with before. Again, there was a big study done. There's quite a lot of notable flooding associated with the River Thames, and there's a couple of other tributaries that sort of run parallel down the valley near Oxfordshire. There's demand for development. There's quite a strong interaction between those river levels and groundwater levels. It's been measured in various piezometers, been recorded, and you can see a very nice, as the river levels go up, you see the same shape occurring within the groundwater, but often there'll be a time lag, the sort of zone of influence expanding. The river level goes up first, and then as you get further away, you see this peak sort of being picked up in the piezometers at different distances from the river. And obviously there's a certain damping and lag effect. The further away you get, so the less of a response you get to that. But it's quite well known that when river levels are high, there's sort of flooding of the sewers and the highway drains, etc. in Oxford. It causes quite a lot of problems, and then at some occasions it sort of actually comes out and floods the roads and that type of thing. So the flood defence scheme was we did some groundwater modelling in combination with the surface water modelling that was looking at the heights and the flood levels. We were looking at what the groundwater would do, what would happen if you installed a barrier beneath the flood defences. Would that cause an impact on the ecology, and would it cause groundwater levels to rise and back up behind it, which may then impact on properties close to the flood defences? There's also the examples. So I talked about the research I did on the River Tame, which goes through Birmingham. It's the river that goes under Spaghetti Junction. A lot of it's been artificially moved, and some of the riverbanks are not natural, but it's still conveying groundwater that comes out of the Birmingham aquifer, which is a big sandstone aquifer, and then on top of that is a layer of sand and gravel. So there's sort of two aquifers interacting, and then they both discharge to the River Tame. So in the study, we had a borehole on either side of the river and a water level monitoring in the river itself. And so this was all recorded at sort of 5-minute intervals. And it was very clear as the river level went up. Birmingham's quite a flashy catchment. It's an urban catchment, so there's a rapid runoff, well connected to a sort of drainage system, and that drainage system goes into the Tame quite often. So there's a very rapid response, a very high peak. And then we'd see that in the river, and then on either side you'd see this very almost instant response in the groundwater level. And from that you can actually do some modelling and calculations. You look at the time lag between when you get the peak in the river level and when you see the peak in the piezometer. You know how far away they are from the river. And you can estimate the storage and transmissivity of the aquifer. So you can use the shape of those groundwater hydrographs compared with the river to sort of calculate interesting things about how the aquifer is responding.
And that idea of the rivers that have been sort of made to be underground or have gone underneath cities, and so same with London, I think. Is there any risk there when it comes to groundwater? Because you kind of said that groundwater kind of naturally goes where it wants to go. Does it easily follow when a river gets changed or when it gets put under? Or is there often issues that arise from that?
The river is there because it's in the lowest point in the catchment, and that's where the groundwater will flow to the lowest point. So if you put the original surface water course inside a culvert, you could potentially seal it and prevent a connection with the groundwater system. But the groundwater will then rise and then flow elsewhere to follow the lowest point. So you do get the situation where they lay new pipes and sewers and they have this sort of granular fill material around them, and then you get the groundwater sort of flowing through that instead of potentially within the culvert itself. But I would expect you would get a groundwater rise. If there's nowhere to drain the groundwater to, then it will sort of back up and rise around it.
And groundwater can create quite a pressure, can't it? Like water pressure can do a lot more, I think, than we expect it. So if you culvert it and through a groundwater reserve, any issues of like the water pressure?
Yes, good point. So the deeper you are, the bigger the difference between the groundwater level and where you are, the bigger the pressure. So it's always a consideration when designing subterranean structures or quarries or landfills or anything like that where there's a groundwater table presence. And this is, I was talking about this flotation effect. So there's quite a lot of upward pressure. Some of these structures could actually float out of the ground. I think it has been known before. So they're obviously, when they design them, they take that into account. But it could cause cracking if they're not designed appropriately to be strong enough or to have some drainage. You see on these cuttings and road embankments, you often see drainage points and holes in the wall, and that's to relieve the pressure behind it to prevent damage to the structure.
Is there anything you think we've not covered when it comes to that interaction between groundwater and the other sources of flooding?
Well, just to say that the climate change thing is quite significant. I would say there's less understanding than there could be of groundwater flood risk at the moment, which is obviously you're trying to change that with your project, and it's below the ground and people can't see it. But then it's going to get worse in the future. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of this coastal impact of sea level rise, which is pretty much guaranteed to happen at some point over the next couple of 100 years. The exact extent of that is not known, but the whole perimeter of the coastline where there's an aquifer present, you'll get a readjustment of systems. Potentially sewers which were above the water table may start to fall in that zone of groundwater fluctuation and get more infiltration. Groundwater drainage systems, a lot of the fens, etc., depend on being drained for agriculture. The groundwater table, they'll be that much higher, more inflows. Tidal locking will limit the time that groundwater can be discharged to a shorter period. So there's quite a lot of impact from that climate change that's going to take place. And we already don't understand as much as perhaps we should do about groundwater flooding now, so it's going to make it worse.
And something you said there reminded me of something I thought earlier when you were sharing, that this idea people can't see groundwater and so it remains very out of sight, out of mind. And I think you're right, when people see those springs coming up, they think that's where the groundwater comes from, that spring is the point at which groundwater, and then that feeds the entire river. But the way you're saying it is actually that spring might be like the starting point, but actually that groundwater is coming up all along that riverbed and is feeding it kind of throughout its flow. And that's probably, I guess, why the river gets bigger as it goes, because obviously that tiny little spring at the very beginning probably can't feed the entire river.
Yes. So if you think about it as there's a certain contribution of groundwater for every square metre of riverbed, and so as the total sort of catchment of that riverbed increases and the amount of groundwater that it's been exposed to, the further downriver you go, the more groundwater will have gone into it. So hence the increase of flow in there. And it's commonly misunderstood. People see a spring and then we'll talk about, underground rivers and how the water diviner did his thing and they'd drill the hole and hit the underground river, etc. But if you think about it, wherever you sort of drilled that hole in the aquifer, you were going to encounter the water table. It's sort of like if you go to the beach, there's not only one spot you dig a hole, it fills with water. You can go somewhere else and dig another hole, still going to fill with water. You're not trying to hit one particular underground river, as they refer to it, or spring point. The spring is just probably the lowest point where you're going to get that water coming out, or coincides with a particularly sort of big fracture or feature which can sort of focus that water discharge. But it's present across the whole of that aquifer. That's the way to think about groundwater beneath the river system. You go to a river and you can dig in the river bank, if it's a sandy river, and you can immediately see water coming in, which is not necessarily the river water. It's likely it's the groundwater. In Birmingham, part of the research was looking at these contaminant plumes, chemicals that, say, were spilt from the industrial past of Birmingham, and they go into the groundwater table, and then that groundwater, the only discharge point is the river, so it's flowing to the lower point. So you get this plume of contaminants travelling with the groundwater. It gets to the river, and then it comes up through the bed of the river. So we installed these piezometers in the bed of the river. We measured sort of high concentrations of these different contaminants coming up through the bed of the river. And the only way they'd got there is via the groundwater pathway. And it was very clear. You could see the contaminant plume coming out on one side of the river, and then that was, say, across half of that riverbed, and then the other side it was completely clean, because that was groundwater coming from the other side of the valley, which had no contaminants. So it was quite a good way of seeing that it was groundwater that was coming up through the bed of that river. So the river water itself sort of flows through the river and the top fraction of the river sediment, but as you go down, that's groundwater in there. So in the bed of the river, that's groundwater that's coming up, and it's got a very different sort of chemical composition to the river water. So you could detect these contaminants in the bed of the river in the groundwater, but you wouldn't detect them in the surface water because of the dilution of all the rest of the river water coming down. You would never pick them up by just sampling the river water because of the concentration dilution. It's just another way of highlighting that interaction between the groundwater and the surface water systems.
And again, I'm assuming that those pollutants still have risk, even though they're diluted, and you might not be able to test them at the top of the river. Is there still a risk of them being in the river?
Yes. Again, it's sort of, the concentration, the mass divided by the sort of the volume in the river. So they may be present in very sort of trace amounts. That's a decision for the Environment Agency. But if you measured them in the groundwater itself, just as they were coming into the river, the concentration would be much higher. So really, we were trying to look at the mass coming into the river rather than just the concentration by itself to get an idea of what the impact was.
That sounds fantastic.
It's just a very interesting topic. There are maps, so you can use flooding from river or tidal level, and that will give you an indication of where like a really extreme flood level might get to, and that might have an influence on what the groundwater table is doing in response to that. So you can get some good idea by looking at fairly readily available resources, such as the BGS site gives you the geology, and you can work out if you're on an aquifer or not. And there are EA monitoring boreholes around with water levels in them. So shouldn't be beyond the ability of most communities to sort of at least get an idea of groundwater surface water interactions and how it might relate to their town.
Although the hope is that eventually there'll be some very public groundwater flood risk maps that people can access and have it a lot easier to hand than having to kind of review geology themselves. Because I've looked at some geological maps and been like, well, it's technically an aquifer, but I don't know how to tell whether or not that aquifer itself has a risk of flooding or not. But that's when I didn't live in those areas though. So I think if you live there, you probably have a bit more of a local knowledge to add to that as well.
Yes. Well, you do have to sort of think in 3 dimensions a little bit, What's my floor level in relation to the river level, in relation to the groundwater level, which sort of sits in between the two. Go from there.
Thank you, Paul, for joining me today. And thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. Please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising? Or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. Thank you.